Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book Learning to Walk in the Dark, says, "We are never more in danger of stumbling than when we think we know where we're going." Well, I think that's true. It's only when there is no more light to direct the way, no more maps or compasses, that we fully are vulnerable to God. Darkness offers us the space to set aside the God we have created and to see what emerges. Today we're going to look at one of the most troublesome and difficult books in the Old Testament, the book of Job. I thank you for joining on this journey as we continue Old Testament windows. On the morning of April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault settled violently, and San Francisco was shaken by a terrible earthquake. Huge cracks opened up in the earth, buildings shuddered and collapsed, and fire swept through the city, leaving it virtually destroyed. Thousands who went to bed peacefully the night before awoke to a world that had fallen apart around them. If seismic devices could measure personal tragedy, then Job's earthquake would have registered pretty high on the Richter scale. In one day, he lost everything he owned, and almost everyone that he held dear. Because of what Job endured and the way that he endured it, his name has become synonymous with suffering. I'm going to invite you to pause the video now and get into the book of Job by reading the passage in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And as you read it, think about these questions. How does God come across in this passage? How does Job come across? How does Satan come across? What questions does this passage raise in your mind? And I'd invite you to take out a piece of paper and maybe make a list of those questions as you work through this. Throughout history, people have wrestled with the problem of evil, especially with the question of why the innocent suffer. Logic would seem to dictate three possible solutions to the problem. 1. God is not all-powerful, and therefore cannot prevent suffering. 2. God is not completely just and good, and therefore allows the innocent to suffer. Or 3. Those who suffer are not completely innocent, and therefore deserve their fate. Now, unlike the Greeks or the Western philosophers, the Israelites never questioned God's power or goodness. These were foundational to their theology. Therefore, when someone suffered, the conclusion to them was self-evident. The person had done something to deserve the suffering. We can see reflections of that in some of the New Testament stories that we're familiar with. Who sinned that this man was born blind, for instance? So, although this conclusion may seem inescapable in the abstract, it doesn't always fit the facts, as we see in the story of Job, and also as we see in that story of the man that was born blind. But in order to solve the enigma, the reader in the book of Job is allowed to overhear a conversation in heaven between the Lord and Satan. And during that conversation, the Lord affirms that Job is, quote, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. So, in a way, it's a good thing that we're armed with this knowledge from the beginning of the story, because it forces us as readers to conclude that suffering sometimes defies the neat logic of these three possibilities. Even though Job's suffering was extreme, it was by no means unique. In one form or another, his story is reenacted every day in a broken and fallen world. We see that in some sense, or at least those questions arise in the situation we find ourselves in the world right now. But during such times, we find that Job somewhat personifies our grief and our painful sense of loss. Have you ever wondered why it was that God was permitting you to suffer? How did you handle that? It's an age-old question. Why do you think bad things happen to people? I invite you to pause the video here and discuss that. Even though Job's suffering was extreme, it was by no means unique. In one form or another, his story is reenacted every day in a broken and fallen world. We see that in some sense, or at least those questions arise in the situation we find ourselves in the world right now. But during such times, we find that Job somewhat personifies our grief and our painful sense of loss. Have you ever wondered why it was that God was permitting you to suffer? How did you handle that? It's an age-old question. Why do you think bad things happen to people? I invite you to pause the video here and discuss that. The God of the book of Job keeps us on edge. Twice we see God involved in a divine wager with Satan. By the time we come to the end of the second chapter of the book of Job, we may begin to wonder about God as Job's life is devastated without apparent cause. I mean, try to put yourself in Job's place. How might you have felt as wave after wave of disaster struck? Almost all of us worship a God of quid pro quo, a God who rewards good behavior. But with Job in the middle of the darkness, we may lose sight of God as much as Job did, as we wait to see how this story will end. Of course, the end is not the whole story, maybe not even its primary purpose. It's the events of the story that are our Old Testament windows. I'm going to take an intermission of sorts from the details of the story and invite you to, from what you know from having heard this story before, discuss who are the main characters in this story. So, who did you name? Job, of course. Maybe his wife, family, his friends, so-called friends at least. God, Satan. You really couldn't miss any choice you would have made on an answer. It would be one of the main characters of that story. But I think the main character in this story is darkness. Hear these words from Job chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Afterward Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it." So we see as the story unfolds, darkness is everywhere for Job. It's not that Job fears the darkness, it's that he's lost in it. The God that he knew has disappeared into the shadows. In this story, it's God's actions that seem more human-like, and it's Job who's the one who never gives up, who stays faithful. God appears unaware and unmoved by Job's disintegrating life. Much of the book, of course, tells of the interaction with Job's three so-called friends. It's been often said with friends like that, who needs enemies? And that's certainly the case here. But these friends of Job seem to have the same kind of quid pro quo expectation of God that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to invite you to pause here and think about a time when you wanted to help someone but didn't know how to do so. How did you feel? And along with that, think about how has somebody supported you through difficult times, and what are some other ways of supporting someone? Poor Job finds no help from his friends. Bewildered, finding no satisfaction from the things they share with him, Job continues to seek an audience with God, presenting his complaints, but he's met only with silence. In fact, it's 37 chapters into the story, and God's character is still eerily unknowable. But something changes at the opening of chapter 38. The story changes dramatically. God appears in a whirlwind, and God asks Job a frank question. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? What kind of tone do you imagine hearing that question from God? You may wish to pause the video here and think about that or discuss it for a moment. In fact, God hurdles a long series of questions toward Job in chapter 38. What seems to be the point of all these questions that God asks? Is he just beating Job down? Although Job can't see it, God seems to be saying that the darkness of which Job himself has spoken dozens of times is not coming from the outside, but coming from the inside of Job himself, spilling from within his mouth. God reveals to Job that darkness is not chaos. Darkness is part of the form and order of a complex world, another facet of creation. I invite you to pause here again and do some reflection on the role of darkness in this story. Perhaps you don't disagree, or perhaps you don't agree with that analysis, that darkness is a main character in the story. But what role does darkness play in the story and in Job's life, and perhaps in your own life as well? The ancient rabbis believed that the Messiah would come in the darkness. Perhaps this is because darkness offers to disorient our senses and cause us to see things in a different way. If you've ever kept awake in the dark, you know how different the world becomes, both strange and familiar at the same time. In darkness, we're not entirely sure what that sound was that we heard, or who that is that's standing across from us, whether that's someone who's here to help us or to harm us. We're just not sure. This is both a gift and a fright. Like Job, in the darkness we lose the God that we think we knew, and then we wait to see what happens next. Well, God never really gives Job an answer to his situation. We know the story of the wager in heaven, but Job doesn't know that story. Job doesn't seem to be granted an explanation for his suffering. Instead, he has to struggle with it himself, try to discover a meaning for it for himself. But part of the discovery is to see his suffering itself as one of God's most precious gifts. To withhold the full story from Job, even after the test is over, keeps him walking by faith and not by sight. He doesn't come to a place where he says in the end, now I see it all. He actually never sees it all, but what he does see is God. So in the end, Job loves God not for the reward, but because God is God. And this is all the more remarkable since Job didn't seem to have the benefit of a covenant community of faith like you and I do, or any stories about God's mighty acts in history like our Bible brings to us, not the revelation of God's purpose through the pages of Scripture. His whole experience contradicted the principle of loving God for his own sake. So one might make the case that Job's story is one of the greatest stories of faith in the whole Bible. As I said at the beginning, this is a troublesome and difficult book. Thank you for hanging in there through this lesson, and again, may we continue to look for pictures and windows of God in these pages of the Old Testament. My friends, this is going to conclude our Old Testament windows study. I thank you for hanging in there with me through these 8 sessions. It's been a challenge, not the way we expected when we started this course those several weeks ago, but thank you for your participation, and may you continue to be safe and well where you are, and we look forward to the time to be back together again very soon. God bless you.